Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the section The Leech in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I also have a very brief discussion of the film Invasion of the Body Snatchers to accompany the section. So let's get started. The Leech. And Zarathustra walked thoughtfully farther and deeper through forests and past swampy places, but as happens with those who think on difficult things, on his way he unintentionally trod on a man, and behold, all at once a cry of pain and 2 curses and 20 little invectives spurted up into his face, so that in his fright he raised his stick and brought it down on the man he had trodden on. But he immediately came to his senses, and his heart laughed at the folly he had just committed. "Forgive me," he said to the man he had trodden on, who had angrily risen and sat down again. "Forgive me, and first of all accept a parable. How a wanderer, dreaming of distant things, unintentionally stumbles over a dog on a lonely road, a dog lying in the sun. How they both start up and let fly at one another like mortal enemies, these two, frightened to death. Thus it happened with us. And yet, how little was lacking for them to caress one another, this dog and this solitary, for they are both solitaries." "Whoever you may be," said the trodden-on man, still angry, "you have come too near me with your parable, and not only with your foot. For look, am I a dog?" And thereupon the sitting man arose and drew his naked arm from the swamp. For previously he had lain stretched out on the ground, concealed and unrecognizable, like someone lying in wait for swamp game. "But what are you doing?" cried Zarathustra in alarm, for he saw a great deal of blood was running down the naked arm. "What has happened to you? Has an evil beast bitten you, unhappy man?" The bleeding man laughed, still irritated. "What is it to do with you?" he said, and made to go off. "Here I am at home in my domain. Whoever wants to question me, let him. But I shall hardly reply to a blockhead." "You are wrong," said Zarathustra compassionately, and held him fast. "You are wrong. Here you are not in your home, but in my kingdom, and I will have no one come to harm here. But nonetheless, call me what you like. I am what I must be. I call myself Zarathustra." "Very well. Up yonder leads the way to Zarathustra's cave. It is not far. Will you not tend your wounds in my home? Things have gone ill with you in this life, you unhappy man. First a beast bit you, and then a man trod on you." But when the trodden-on man heard the name of Zarathustra, he changed. "What has happened to me?" he cried. "Who concerns me in this life except this one man, Zarathustra, and that one beast that lives on blood, the leech? For the sake of the leech, I have lain here beside this swamp like a fisherman, and already my outstretched arm has been bitten 10 times. Now a fairer leech bites from my blood, Zarathustra himself. O happiness, O wonder! Praised be this day that lured me to the swamp. Praised be the greatest, liveliest cupping glass alive today. Praised be the great leech of conscience, Zarathustra." So the last time we left Zarathustra, he was having a conversation with a prophet, which then led into a nice conversation about nihilism, because the prophet that he had a conversation with didn't see any meaning or worth in anything whatsoever. And then this led to the next section, the conversation with the kings, where Zarathustra had the conversation with the two kings, of course, because that's the name of the section. And they were unhappy with how everybody was not being genuine and really meaning what they said in their whole core. And so they sought out Zarathustra. So from these last two sections, we have this whole relation and discussion about nihilism, a lack of meaning, there really not being any value whatsoever, and the values that are upheld are all just like masks in a way, where everything's pretty much hollow, everybody just performs along like they have to do. And then we come into the section with the Leech, where Zarathustra's deep in thought stumbles on this man who's just lying in the ground, and then, curiously enough, the man sticks his arm into the swamp, wanting it to be covered in leeches, whilst at the same time the man seems to have been bitten by some sort of beast and seems completely unconcerned by that. And initially his reaction to Zarathustra is calling him a blockhead, but then suddenly when he recognizes the name, he's very much enamored by him. And then we round off the first little part there with him saying, "Oh happiness, oh wonder, praised be this day that lured me to the swamp. Praised be the best, liveliest cupping glass alive today. Praised be the great leech of conscience, Zarathustra." So we have Zarathustra himself have this relation into being a leech that's being made by the man. And so really we can use this initial part, let's say, with the leeches as a metaphor for how things, in a very general sense, tend to want to suck the life and the blood out of you, almost vampiric in a way. And it's just all the different things we can say in an everyday sense. Normally it's people's work, of course, because that's one of the things that we put a great considerable amount of time and effort into, and so our energies are always sapped out of us from having done whatever work it is, of course. And so we have all these various different leeches as sapping the very life force out of us there. And we could also say, and where it's going to go to in the next section, and have this lovely relationship into philosophy, where we have this whole move where philosophy should be a thing that enables us, reinvigorates us, makes us feel energized, rather than sapping the life force out of us in a given way. So here we can see that within this whole sucking the whole life force and blood out of us, feeling drained in a given way, and quite happily wanting to do it as well, that the man is, that you then have that whole relation back into how just knowledge itself has been shaped into such a way that it sapped the life out of us. Because of all that focus on metaphysics, the afterlife and death, it literally drains us of all our life force, is a way of putting it, creative energies, and we're just left in this sort of zombie-like state, living out a zombie-like existence. And so we have this fantastic sort of thing that keeps on popping up within Zarathustra, is for us to be reinvigorated and re-energized, like having a massive drink of some sort of energy drink all the time, having that caffeine boost and being invigorated about things rather than being sapped all the time. And so continuing on then, we'll have that nice relation into philosophy that's going to be built up a little here. Thus spoke the man who had been trodden on, and Zarathustra rejoiced at his words and their fine, respectful manner. Who are you? He insisted, and offered him his hand. Between us there is still much to elucidate and clear up, but already it seems to me it is bright, broad daylight. I am the conscientious man of the spirit, asked the other, and scarcely anyone is sterner, stricter, and more severe in things of the spirit than I. Apart from him from whom I learned, Zarathustra himself, better to know nothing than half know many things, better to be a fool on one's own account than a wise man at the approval of others. I go to the root of things. What matter if it be great or small, if it be swamp or sky? A hand's breadth of ground is enough for me, if only it be thoroughly firm ground. A hand's breadth of ground, one can stand upon that. In truly conscientious knowledge, there is nothing great and nothing small. So perhaps you are an expert on the leech, asked Zarathustra. And do you probe the leech down to its ultimate roots, conscientious man? Oh, Zarathustra, answered the man who was trodden on, that would be a colossal task. How could I undertake it? But what I am master of and expert on is the leech's brain. That is my world, and that too is a world. But forgive me that my pride here speaks out, for here I have not my equal. That is why I said, here I am at home. How long have I probed this one thing, the brain of the leech, so that slippery truth should no longer slip away from me? Here is my kingdom. For its sake I have cast away all others. For its sake I have grown indifferent to all others, and close beside my knowledge couches my black ignorance. The conscience of my spirit demands of me that I know one thing, and apart from that know nothing. I am disgusted by all the semi-intellectual, all the vaporous, hovering visionary. Where my honesty ceases, I am blind, and want to be blind. But where I want to know, I also want to be honest. That is severe, stern, strict, cruel, inexorable. Because you, O Zarathustra, once said, spirit is the life that itself cuts into life. That led and seduced me to your teaching, and truly, with my own blood have I increased my own knowledge. As evidence indicates, Zarathustra interposed, for blood continued to run down the naked arm of the man of conscience, for 10 leeches had bitten into it. Oh, you strange fellow, how much this evidence tells me, for it tells me about yourself, and perhaps I could not pour all of it into your stern ears. Very well, let us part here, but I should like to meet you again. Up yonder leads the way to my cave. Tonight you shall there be my welcome guest. And I should also like to make amends to your body for treading upon you. I shall think about that. But now a cry of distress calls me hurriedly away from you. Thus spoke Zarathustra. And so in the next part then, we have the man say, I am the conscientious man of the spirit. So the German word for spirit is Geist, which can mean either spirit or the mind. And in this given context, we can see that the man with the leeches wants to attach the leeches to him as a form of burdening himself down, because he's going to ultimately gain much higher form of knowledge by doing so, because it's within that whole process there of wanting to attain a form of enlightenment, let's say. And we have this wonderful relation into Socrates a little bit that's going on here, because he says, better to know nothing than half know many things, better to be a fool on one's own account than a wise man at the approval of others. I go to the root of things. So as a side little track here for a second, one of the famous things that Socrates said was, I know nothing, which upon initially thinking about it is kind of a strange sentence and a statement to make, because knowing nothing would seem completely pointless, especially if you're to go and learn from someone. You wouldn't want to then go and learn from someone who knows absolutely nothing whatsoever. In fact, it would seem really counterproductive. And especially if you have to go to a university or a college or someplace where you're going to have to pay for that education, you suddenly don't want your lecturer or your teacher to therefore be someone who knows nothing. Oh, that's fantastic. I'm going to go learn about political history of whatever it is. Oh, but the lecturer, he was great because he knew absolutely nothing. And so what did we learn? Nothing. Great course. And so it'd seem initially that what exactly is all this knowing nothing going on about? And for Socrates, it rather has this nice objective approach that you can take to analyze things without your own bias. So one of the main things you get out of Plato is having a nice conversation about lots of different topics and themes, and there'll be lots of different opinions about whatever topic it is they're having a conversation about for that given dialogue. So being on knowledge, ethics, the soul, and all those lovely jubbly topics. And they'll all come to Socrates as an agoniant sort of character and seek for Socrates to go and fix whatever problems it is that they have. And Socrates, being the good agoniant that he is, takes an entirely objective approach to resolving the problems that they have. So he doesn't try and have any bias whatsoever, and tries to see both opinions, both sides of the argument, and then overall by the end of the dialogue you're meant to have reached the main conclusion from whatever topic it was from the argument. So the main gist of the whole thing for Plato would be you have an uncertainty about whatever topic it is that they're having a discussion about, and through the discussion they start to arrive at certain points that's certain, and then by the end of it you have a complete clear picture that's nice, and you can arrive at some sort of form of stability in the midst of it all. So that's a nice little brief sidetrack into Socrates and a little bit about how Plato's dialogues also structurally work there. And so we come back to the man with the leeches on his arm. Then we can say, well, what is the man trying to do? Is wanting to get to the sort of heart and core of things, like what Socrates likes to do within the dialogues as well. And within all that, he'll find the great, truly conscientious knowledge about things, and then that'll become like a leech on his body. So we have this wonderful sort of ethics that's touched upon a little bit here, that the man himself has analyzed the leeches and various different burdens that can be placed upon someone, and so he's wanting to get to the overall best way, best form of life for him by putting all these different leeches on him. And so ultimately he'll have this whole quite happy state of being burdened, having 10 leeches or so, as it says, all attached to him, because, as he says there, the conscience of my spirit demands of me that I know one thing, and apart from that, know nothing. I am disgusted by all this semi-intellectual, all the vaporous, hovering, visionary. So again, we have this nice relation back into the way you can try and privilege someone's point of view, say semi-intellectual, to people that you don't like. Say, well, they don't really know what they're talking about because such and such. And all what this person wants to do for the man is just live their life one way, because they want to have that great lifestyle, that great approach to how they should live their life. And we find out what exactly is the thing that's allowed this man to try and live his life the best way possible is through one of Zarathustra's sayings. And that saying is, spirit is the life that itself cuts into life, that led and seduced me to your teaching, and truly with my own blood have I increased my own knowledge. So there's quite a nice little discussion about this line in Walter Kaufmann's book, Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist. And Walter Kaufmann is one of the main translators of quite a good, significant number of Nietzsche's books from German into English. So this is from page 271. In Zarathustra, a suggestive definition of spirit is offered. Spirit is the life that itself cuts into life. This formulation is part of a long glorification of the spirit. Most of Nietzsche's interpreters and critics have ignored this paradox. And then he gives a couple examples there of Bertram and Klages. Any such view, however, does scant justice to Nietzsche's philosophy. He affirmed both life and spirit. If one decides in advance that one is good and the other is bad, Nietzsche's doctrine may seem ambiguous, Bertram's thesis or self-contradictory, Klages's allegation. Nietzsche rejected the premise that spirit came into the world in a supernatural way, and that a Christian god or Klagesian devil was responsible for its intrusion into nature. He asserted that spirit cuts into life, and that it is its function to counteract man's tendency to yield to his impulses. But he considered it as an instrument used by life in its effort to enhance itself. Spirit is not opposed to life altogether, but directed only against one level of it. Its mission is not to destroy, but to fulfill, to sublimate, or, to use the expression of the meditations, to transfigure and perfect man's nature. So then we have that nice discussion about the line from Kaufmann there. And the key little part of it is that line, spirit is not opposed to life altogether, but directed against one level of it. Its mission is not to destroy, but to fulfill, to sublimate, or, to use expression of meditations, to transfigure and perfect man's nature. So, when we initially think about perfecting man's nature or transfiguring it in a way, we can initially use the examples of art, because when we think, at least in a traditional way, then art's main mission, at least what's argued within aesthetics, is for beauty. And when you think about beauty, it's not in the everyday sense of it, but rather going towards this idealist perfect form of what the human body should look like. And so an example of that would be, of course, Michelangelo's David, a beautiful statue. Why? Because it shows the human form in this absolutely perfect state. Of course, the rebuttal to that, as a little sidetrack again, is to say, well, there is no pure idea of beauty, because what we think is beautiful will depend upon different historical contexts, and so that'll be a thing that'll change. What we think is beautiful in one time period will be different from another, and there's no overall pure idea of what something that's beautiful is. So coming back to the Nietzsche then, we can see, well, how you can try and get towards what the man has done there is that he wants to try and transfigure and improve his own sort of situation by adopting this tenet from Zarathustra, and quite happily has the leeches on himself, thinking that's the best thing that he can do. But then we have Zarathustra very briefly make two forms of criticizing of the way in which the man has used Zarathustra's own philosophy. So the first one is when they talk about the leeches themselves. When the man's arguing that he studies leeches, Zarathustra says, "So perhaps you are an expert on the leech?" asked Zarathustra. "And do you probe the leech down to its ultimate roots, conscientious man?" Because here we have a criticism from only looking at things on the surface level, and even though he says, well, what he tends to do is study the leech's brain, is what the man says, then Zarathustra's like, well, did you take that to its roots? And so we have this lovely relation into Nietzsche's own philosophy there, where he's saying, well, you have to look at the absolute core and foundations of things and not just the surface level of things. And so an example that's a nice one to go back to, that's been used in previous episodes as well, is Nietzsche's idea of genealogy is very much apparent there, because you can say, well, what genealogy does is study the history and roots of why we think a certain way and why we think certain ideas are bad or good, and also we can view how those ideas change over time at the same time. And so just a nice easy example of how we perform genealogy without any relation into any deep topics is just that we also perform genealogies of ourselves and go to different websites like ancestry.com and so forth, all to find out our background and history. And Nietzsche also says, well, that's what we should do when we study ideas, because ideas are not these absolute pure things, but rather they have a history. So let's go study that, and let's go find out all the roots and the core and the juicy details And then we'll be able to have a much better understanding of him. And nicely enough as well, that was continued on as an idea by 20th century French philosopher Michel Foucault, who also had the idea of an archaeology of knowledge. And we could see why that would be the case. He would use that as a concept there, because very much like genealogy, archaeology would be like the Indiana Jones style of unearthing things. And then later, Foucault changes it from an archaeology to a genealogy because it goes even more into the depths and so on. So we have that idea then of genealogy approaching there. And then we also have, at the end, Zarathustra say to the man, "O you strange fellow, how much this evidence tells me, for it tells me about yourself. And perhaps I could not pour all of it into your stern ears." So, what's nice about this little line is that we have the man take this one line from Zarathustra and have it fit to his own life. And that's the point that Zarathustra wants to make. You've took a certain little aspect of it and you've made it work for you, but that's not how it actually works. And what's quite interesting here is we have a nice relation into Nietzsche's own philosophy and the ways and various different history of Nietzsche being misread by people who just read everything completely at face value, don't go to the roots of things, and all try to make it fit within a given agenda or given approach. And it doesn't precisely argue for those given things in the first place. And of course, the most famous one of that is where his sister manipulates and edits his books and so forth for the will to power, and then tries to make it have a Nazi agenda where there's no Nazi agenda there. And their whole movement within the 20th century, not only to argue for Nietzsche's philosophy and building it as a philosophy, but also to distance it from and criticize all the immense harm that his sister did to his philosophy at the same time. But it's interesting how we just have that nice little relation into it there from that little line. And what's so great about it is, well, is that whole point. It tells me more about you than it does about what I actually said. It all fits into that psychology of, well, why is this person using this line in this given way, in this given context? What can I read into how they think from all that? So we get that nice sort of psychology about the person and the use and manipulation of someone else's view at the same time you could have in the midst of all this. And so a good movie to briefly discuss and touch upon for this section is The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And there's two versions of the movie from 1956, and then there's a remake from 1978. And the brief synopsis of the original plot from Google is: in Santa Maria, California, Dr. Miles Bennett is baffled when all his patients come to him with the same complaint. Their loved ones seem to have been replaced by emotionless imposters. Despite others' dismissive denials, Dr. Bennett, his former girlfriend Becky, and his friend Jack soon discover that their patients' suspicions are true. An alien species of human duplicates grown from plant-like pods is taking over the small town. So we have that nice 1950s sci-fi movie there where the town's getting slowly taken over by emotionless aliens. And so the whole film itself represents the 1950s paranoia of communism, and it represents that whole Cold War mentality within America of Russia and communism as an idea, and the very fact that anyone you know, your closest friend, your neighbor, the man who works at the post office, they could all be communists. The horror, the horror. And from all that, we can have that nice sort of relation into Marx, and also the misuse, arguably, of Marx's own philosophy, its manipulation, and the way it's forced to fit into state agendas and various countries' different ideologies within their own given context. But we could also go back to those points about Nietzsche there as well, where it's very much almost self-aware that if you try to read philosophy, you get seduced by whoever it is that you're reading, and you very much become so much enamored by it, and then you almost become adoptive of a certain aspect of it, and then that has a direct effect upon your life and the way you think and the way you live. So philosophy is not just simply just a thing that exists in a very much abstract way, dealing with abstract ideas and concepts. On the contrary, these ideas and concepts, although sometimes complex and abstract, will have a profound effect upon someone's life and how they live their life. And not only that, but when we come down to read it, then we also come into the whole points about, well, there's that manipulation of it, and going back again into those points about Nietzsche's own philosophy to say, well, the Nazis tried to manipulate Nietzsche's philosophy and make it work in a way that was completely against what it was arguing for in the first place, to the points as well we still got today, that horrible association with Nazis, as well as all those misunderstandings and misreadings of Nietzsche's own philosophy. And there's that sort of irony in the midst of all this to say, well, we have that sort of relation into that section, the apostates previously, where people who lost their belief in God still wanted something to believe in. Nietzsche saw within all that as well that whole move towards wanting that relation back into idolatry still. People still having that whole need to want to idolize and worship things, and it'll not be God anymore, but it'll be people or ideas and so forth. And the last thing that Nietzsche would want, at least, would be for his own philosophy to be held up in such a way where it would be in a form of a lifestyle, for everybody to go around and suddenly read the Zarathustra every day on a Sunday, for example. Because, again, at the heart of it all is that move for people to be more critical, more engaging with what they're being told, not accepting everything at face value, and for people to create themselves and their own ideas. And from that, we're seeing as well the relation into the misuse of how knowledge could work there and its manipulation, whilst is Nietzsche wants the opposite of that, for us to challenge knowledge and create ourselves. So that wraps up this episode. So in the previous episode as well, we had that relation to nihilism, lack of value, meaning, and then we're continuing on this path as we're going along, where in this episode we've had a relation into manipulation of knowledge and trying to make it fit an agenda. And from that as well, we can say, then we can analyze the psychology of that person. Why are they manipulating it this way? Let's have a look at this person, and from all that we can get into understanding of what they think, because that'll allow us into understanding why it's been manipulated in the first place. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the section The Leech in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Feel free to check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/dissectingphilosophy. Feel free to also drop me an email at my address, dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com. Feel free to also tip me a coffee at ko-fi.com/dissectingphilosophy. And lastly, I can be found on Twitter at I am a rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time.